Martin Luther King finally said, I need to connect the civil rights movement with the anti Vietnam War movement, with the labor movement of the time, and so forth. Ever since that period, for reasons we can talk about if we have time, the left has
You
fragmented,
call the
exactly as you
system in
said,
which we currently live
largely into
militarized
a kind
corporate
of.
capitalism. What do you see as being the main features of this system?
Well, I think the most important point is that it is a system. I think the mainstream media and actually much of the liberal and left, even the left, has lost sight of the idea that so many of the big problems we're dealing with, whether we're talking about war and militarism or climate change or racism or economic inequality, have lost sight of the fact that we are dealing with an intertwined system in which all these different hierarchies of power based on class and race and gender and so forth, and which connect issues like climate and war and capitalism, has been this way of connecting the dots and recognizing that we have to confront a broader system, which is at the root of all these different problems, has been lost. So, what is the nature of this system? It's a First of all, it's a system of enormously concentrated economic and political power, where we have 1%, 1% of 1% of the population pretty much dominating politics and the political agenda and much of our social and economic life. And since the late 60s, that connecting of the dots has been lost, and we have lost a mainstream conversation. I mean, how often do you turn on CNN, which is very anti Trumpist, but never talks about the problems of capitalism? In fact, in large part, is critiquing Trump because he seems to be threatening what is regarded as the democratic rubric, whether it's the FBI and the CI, the institutional norms that they view as central to capitalism itself. So this is a long answer for simply saying you're right that the thrust of my book is to argue that if you're dealing with an intersectional, universalizing, deadly system, the only way you can successfully resist it is if you connect the dots and try to build a movement that is, first of all, understands the nature of these connected problems that they're dealing with and are able to coordinate with each other. It doesn't mean that you get rid of identity politics, or that people won't be able to work on issues of greatest urgency and passion to them, but that for this movement to really make a difference, particularly in the short time period we have facing us, we need to connect these dots and make clear that these different movements have shared systemic roots, and that if you're going to solve racism, you're never going to do that without dealing with the racialized history of capitalism in the United States. The same would be true. You can't stop climate change as long as we have a kind of extractive capitalist system that we have. You certainly cannot stop militarism and war if you don't deal with the nature of our economy, which requires the kind of globalizing militarism that opens up markets and creates cheap labor and so forth. So you put your finger on the central contradiction of the movement, and the book is an effort to sort of argue for universalizing the resistance, by which I mean bringing together these different fragmented, siloed movements, where which, by the Martin Luther King finally said, I need to connect the civil rights movement with the anti Vietnam War movement, with the labor movement of the time, and so forth. Ever since that period, for reasons we can talk about if we have time, the left has fragmented, exactly as you said, which, by the way, interviews with activists show is something that activists themselves are now quite aware of, that they feel that the movement is jeopardized by failing to see the connections and work together on these interconnected hierarchies of power. So we deal with the core at the problem
movements
at
that
the
are
heart of
coming
all of
together?
it.
And secondly, what would be the strategy specifically to get people to realize the need for connecting the dots and coming together and in an intersectional kind of resistance, as you call it?
Yeah. Well, great question again. So a few different quick things. One is I'm thinking of the 2014 People's Climate March in New York, which was a really good model of kind of a universalizing resistance. And that was, I don't know if you were there, Greg, but there were about 400,000 people marching in New York City against climate change. But there were segments of that march which were walking under the banner of feminism, and others that were marching under the banner of labor that had been organized by unions and so forth. There were segments marching under anti-war and peace organizations and so forth. And I think climate is a great example. If you look at Standing Rock, where indigenous cultures really put together a lot of cultural and economic, anti-corporate, oil and pipeline industries and so forth. There's something about the climate movement that's naturally more intersectional and universalizing. So I see the climate movement, the climate justice movement, the environmental justice movement as an example of a promising development of the kind I'm trying to argue for in the book. So I think this is I agree with you. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And I don't think my book gives, some magic bullet for doing so, but it kind of lays out the entire range of issues that activists are now facing as they try to confront this problem. I think people are more aware of it. And I don't think there's like a simple dogmatic formula. I'm not arguing against identity politics. I'm just saying we need a broader conversation about capitalism as a system, which has pretty much been abandoned, as I said, since the late 60s, and try to find ways that we can make these connections. It doesn't mean you completely merge, because there is a danger, as many people say, that, well, if you merge all these movements into one big movement, then lots of these other issues get subordinated and you get centralized power. I'm very sensitive to that. So I'm not arguing for people abandoning for their issues or their movements. I'm just arguing for a broader consciousness. And this has become now on the left a very central set of concerns as people look at how Trump got elected, and they see that overwhelmingly a lot of white people, and particularly white working people, or middle to lower income whites, not both workers and small business people and so forth, who are also hurt by the system, are voting Republican and supporting Trump. And so that's another way in which I think there may be a unifying. You asked, how can this unify? I've written about some of the dangers of anti-Trumpism because it sort of tends to often legitimate the Republican system that preceded Trump and sort of created Trump. But at the same time, Trump is, because he is a scary guy, he is helping to create a certain kind of unity. After all, the day after he was inaugurated, the Women's March was the biggest day of, protest in history, as far as we know, several million people around the world.
And
since then,
I'm wondering how do we get people to look beyond Trump? I mean, it is such a...
Well, first recognizing that Trump is playing us in a way, because the more negative attention he gets from MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and these very creative, mainstream liberal journalists, the more his base, this is tribalism that he cultivates. So it's important to recognize that when you just put his face on TV, which offers a lot of revenue to these TV stations, you are even though his base is beginning to erode in certain ways because of the Mueller investigation, you're doing what he wants you to do, which is to focus on him. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding that the Republican Party and the corporate donors who really sort of have created the party have also created Trump. I mean, after all, Trump is a billionaire. Maybe not as rich as he says he is, but he's a very wealthy corporate guy. And he comes out of the corporate elite. And there's been this sort of mythology that we should focus on Trump as somehow separate from or apart from this Republican and corporate system that we started talking about at the beginning. And I think this has been very misleading and dangerous because then the focus becomes, well, if we can simply sort of do away with Trump, then the system will go back to normal, as if normal is where we want to be. But we don't want. I remember being in an anti-Trump march, which said, normal is not normal, meaning, we want to deal with Trump. He's dangerous, but the people who are now sitting on MSNBC or CNN and using CIA or FBI officials to say this guy is terrible because he's critiquing the CIA or the FBI. Well, the CIA has been running coups and anti-democratic coups around the world to spread this system, and the FBI, tried to undermine the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and it still infiltrates the left. So we've got to be very careful that the anti-Trumpist movement keeps its eye on the ball, that it keeps its eye on the real systemic issues that are threatening survival. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be dealing with the real dangers that Trump represents, because they're real and they're scary and they're important. But I do think that a lot of the anti-Trump, particularly on the cable TV shows and the more liberal parts of that of that anti-Trump movement, are actually paradoxically serving to legitimate the corporate, universalizing system that Trump has actually that created Trump in some ways. And you're seeing now the Republican Party, which my friend Noam Chomsky calls the most dangerous institution in world history because it's such a climate denier and, militarist kind of thing. It's somehow as if we get rid of Trump, then we can just go back to the normalcy of that system that the CIA and the FBI and the military and the capitalist system perpetrate. And that's itself very dangerous. So that's another part of my book and my thinking, which is that it's very important to challenge Trump, but we've got to keep our eye on the ball and recognize we're dealing with this interconnected system of which Trump really is a very central part.